right, this is lesson 5 in A Long Way from Chicago. And we'll start with our next chapter called The Mouse in the Milk from 1930. From something Dad said, it had dawned on Mary Alice and me that our trip down to Grandma's was meant to be an annual event. Mary Alice pitched a fit. It meant another week of summer vacation away from her friends, Beverly and Audrey. Besides, she said she wasn't over last year's visit yet. One night she'd have a nightmare about old Shotgun Cheatham sitting up in his coffin, and on the night after that she'd dream that Grandma's big old tomcat was jumping at her, or so she said. But having no choice, we went. If any of us had grown over the year, it was Grandma herself, and she still seemed to prize her privacy as much as ever. She mostly stayed home because she said the whole town was a slum and she didn't give two hoots about it, and she wouldn't even have a radio in her house. Mary Alice brought her jump rope to keep herself occupied, though she said jumping rope by yourself was the loneliest job in the world. I took a giant jigsaw puzzle to put together. It was supposed to depict Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh and his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. There wasn't room for it in our Chicago apartment, but in the summers Grandma took down the stove that heated her front room, so there was space to leave a card table up. One night, soon after we arrived, I was working on the puzzle and Grandma was drowsing in her platform rocker. She said she never slept, but she had to wake herself up to go to bed. Earlier, before it got dark, Mary Alice had been jumping rope outside. There weren't a lot of sidewalks in Grandma's town, but a strip of concrete ran from her front door out to the countrified mailbox beside the road. Grandma and I had been listening to Mary Alice. "Jump," said Coolidge, "jump," said Hoover, "jump," said the driver with the furniture mover, and Mary Alice's personal favorite. I had a letter from Nellie, and what do you think it said? Nellie had a baby, and its hair was red. Now how many hairs were on that head? 1, 2, 3. When she got up to 180, Grandma called her inside. So now Mary Alice was sulking somewhere. Grandma's breathing was steady, the way it got before she started snoring. Then I heard a horse clopping past. That was no rare thing around here, but I noticed the silence when the horse stopped outside. Then, right away, heels kicked up its side and the horse galloped off. It was a sound right out of a Tom Mix movie. It's a silent movie with sound effects that are added. I was reaching for a puzzle part that was just blue sky when a flash of light filled the bay window. Then an explosion shook the house and made my puzzle jump. It wasn't as loud as the time Grandma squeezed off 2 rounds tight right here in the front room, but it brought her out of her chair. Like a ship under sail, she made for the front door. Mary Alice appeared from somewhere, and we both looked around Grandma into the night. You could barely see a stump out by the road. It was the post that had held the mailbox, but the mailbox was gone, in several directions. We heard a piece of metal slide down the shingles of the roof, bounce off the gutter, and fall through the snowball bushes. Somebody on horseback had blown Grandma's mailbox sky high. The 4th of July was over, but there were still plenty of loose fireworks around, and this was no small charge, not a baby waker or even a torpedo. This could have been the work of a cherry bomb. Grandma planted her big fists on her big hips, and her jaw clenched in a familiar way. "Cowgills," she said, like that explained it. Grandma slept in a room downstairs to save herself the stairs. Mary Alice and I had rooms upstairs. They were sparsely furnished with iron bedsteads and a lot of dead bugs on the sills. After I got used to how quiet the country was at night, I slept good up there, but I lay awake that night recalling the sound when Grandma's mailbox was blown to smithereens. I was 10, the age when things blowing up interested me, but I wondered who dared to do this to Grandma. My eyelids drooped, and it was morning. The smell of breakfast wafted up from the kitchen. You had to be downstairs on time and in your place, but Grandma's breakfasts were worth it. Pancakes and corn syrup, fried ham and potatoes and onions, anything you wanted, and as much. Mary Alice and I were at the table, and Grandma was at the stove turning one last round of pancakes, when we got a visitor on the back porch. We all looked. The screen on the door blurred her, but it was Grandma's old enemy, Mrs. Effie Wilcox. She didn't make free to rap on the door. She just stood out on the porch in a faded apron and broken boots, working her hands. "Mrs. Dowdle!" Woo-wee! She called out in a tragic voice. Grandma strolled over to the door. What now? She said through the screen wire. Mrs. Wilcox moaned. First of all, she said, can I use it? She nodded towards the back path to the Cobb house and the privy, and she didn't mean the Cobb house. Feel free, Grandma said. Take a pew. But Mrs. Wilcox just stood there on the porch, wringing her hands. I'm so nervous, I don't know if... What's come over you? Grandma said in her least interested voice. Mrs. Wilcox whimpered. Send them kids out of your kitchen so I can tell you. They're having their breakfast, Grandma said, and they're from Chicago, so they've heard everything. Well, it was last night, Mrs. Wilcox said. They come on my place and wrenched up my you-know-what by the post and flung it all over the yard. The you-know-what is, of course, her outhouse. They knocked over your privy 3 months ahead of Halloween? Grandma was interested at last. What's the world coming to? That's what I said, Mrs. Wilcox replied. I'm too nervous to live. All the laws of civilization has broke down and town life is getting too dangerous. My only consolation is that there's a prayer meeting at church tomorrow night, and I've got me some praying to do. Do that, Grandma said. But Mrs. Wilcox couldn't wait another minute. She darted off the porch and down the path to our privy. Grandma settled into her chair to smother her last pancake with corn syrup. Then once again she said, Cowgills. Presently Mary Alice slipped down from her chair and headed outside. When she got to the screen door, Grandma said, I wouldn't use the privy all morning if I was you. The next morning, when I came into the kitchen, a sight stopped me dead at the door. Behind me, Mary Alice pulled up short too. Next to a box of shells, Grandpa Dowdle's old double-barreled Winchester Model 21 was on the kitchen table along with a greasy rag, like Grandma meant to clean it. Just the sight of that gun made my ears ring. Then I saw somebody beside Grandma was in the kitchen, over by the door. He was a big, tall galoot of a kid with narrow eyes. His gaze kept flitting to the shotgun. The uniform he had on was all white, with a cap to match. In his hand was a wire holder for milk bottles. He was ready to make his escape, but Grandma was saying, I hope you have better luck with your milk today than this last batch. I found a dead mouse in your delivery yesterday. The kid's narrow eyes widened. Naw, you never, he said. Be real careful about calling a customer a liar, she remarked. I had to feed that milk to the cat, and the mouse too, of course. Naw, said the kid, reaching around for the knob on the screen door behind him. Grandma was telling one of her whoppers. If she'd found a mouse in the milk, she'd have exploded like the mailbox. She was telling a whopper, and I wondered why. And another thing, she said. I won't be needing a delivery tomorrow. Neither milk nor cream. I'm going away. First that we'd heard of. Mary Alice nudged me hard. I'll be gone tomorrow. I'll be gone tonight and all day tomorrow. And I don't want the milk left out where it'll sour. I won't pay for it. I'm taking my grandkids on a visit to my cousin, Leota Shrewsbury. Another whopper, and a huge one. Grandma off on a jaunt, and us with her? I don't think so. She didn't do things that cost, and she never told anybody her business. Turning from the stove, she pretended surprise at seeing Mary Alice and me there, though she had eyes in the back of her head. Why, there's my grandkids now. She pointed us out with a spatula. They're from Chicago. Gangs run that town, you know, she told the kid. My grandson's in a gang, so you don't want to mess with him. He's meaner than he looks. I hung in the doorway, bug-eyed and short. She was saying I, Joey Dowdle, was a tough guy from Chicago, and this kid was twice my size. He could eat me for lunch. This here is Ernie Cowgill, she said, finishing off the introductions. With a sneer at me, Ernie Cowgill disappeared through the door and stomped off the porch. Grandma, I croaked, you'll get me killed. She waved that away. I just said that for your protection. He'll be scared of you now. He'd believe anything. He's only in 4th grade. Grandma, he's at least 16. That's right, and still in 4th grade, she said. He's the runt of the Cowgill litter. He's got 3 older brothers, and they're big bruisers. They're the ones you wouldn't want to meet up with in a dark alley. She swept shotgun, shells, and the greasy rag off the kitchen table and put them all back behind the wood box. Then she nodded at Mary Alice to set the table for breakfast. When we sat down to eat, I said, "Grandma, what was that shotgun for?" "Bait," she said. "Who's Cousin Leota Shrewsbury?" Mary Alice asked. "Who?" Grandma said. I lurked pretty near home all day. I didn't even go uptown to the Coffee Pot Cafe for fear I'd run into Ernie Cowgill and his brothers. Now I remembered where I'd heard the name. The horse-drawn milk wagon that delivered to the door had a sign on its side that read, "Cowgill's Dairy Farm. From our clover-fed cows to your kitchen. Strictly sanitary. Farm-fresh eggs our specialty." In fact, I'd seen Ernie driving it standing up, handling the reins through a hole in the front window of the wagon. Even at a distance he looked like somebody you wouldn't want to know better. It may have been just a coincidence that a family named Cowgill ran the dairy. I never knew. Noticing how close to home I was keeping, Grandma told me to weed the garden. You didn't want to hang around her too close or she'd give you a job. The garden ran neat and tidy from the back porch down to the cob house beside the yard, where she stretched her clothesline. I weeded through the heat of the day, and every time I got down by the cob house, I had a vision of 4 Cowgill brothers stepping out of it. I could picture them hanging me from the eaves by my belt and taking turns slapping me to sleep. That's like knocking him out. But I saw nothing but the crossed paws of the old tomcat napping just inside the door. The 2 rows of green onions made my eyes water, and the smell was making me woozy. I was thinking seriously of a heat stroke when I heard Mary Alice shriek in the kitchen. She was no screamer, so it brought me to my feet. Now I thought Ernie Cowgill had gotten in and pounced on her. I jumped the garden rows, pounding for the house. But it was only Grandma and Mary Alice in the kitchen. Mary Alice's eyes were big as quarters, like orphan Annie's, and she had both hands clapped over her mouth. Grandma towered over the table. Held high in her hand was a mouse trap, with the mouse still in it, a good-sized mouse. His tail dangled down so far it looked like one of the fly-paper strips that hung from her kitchen ceiling. The spring on the trap had caught the mouse at the neck and nearly pulled its head loose. He was hanging by a thread and not a pretty sight. Mary Alice had already gone into shock. This was one more of those experiences she says gave her nightmares for years. Grandma examined her catch. Now she moved the trap into position over the mouth of the empty bottle. She eased up the spring and the mouse dropped straight in. He hit the bottom of the bottle with a soft thump. She turned back to the drain board and picked up another bottle full of milk, fresh, I suppose, from Ernie Cowgill's morning delivery. Without spilling a drop, she poured milk into the bottle on the table. Mary Alice and I watched like 2 paralyzed people as the milk rose around the mouse's furry gray body until his whiskers began to float. As the milk closed over his head, Mary Alice bolted. If the back door had been latched, she'd have gone straight through the screen wire. Now Grandma was fitting a paper lid over the milk and mouse bottle. I knew not to ask why she was doing this. I didn't even want to know. Mary Alice didn't come back in the house till supper time. Then she didn't want any supper. I watched her move green beans and fat back around the plate with the fork big as her small hand. Grandma ate hearty. After a big wedge of layer cake she pulled back from the table. "Let's step right along and get them dishes washed and dried and put away," she said. She was in a hurry, and I couldn't see why, but then I couldn't see a moment ahead. There was still some evening left, but the light was fading. Grandma stayed in the kitchen after we'd wandered into the front room. But as Mary Alice was reaching for her jump rope to take outside, Grandma turned up and said, "Not tonight." Mary Alice glowered but said nothing. She flopped on the settee and fidgeted. Then she started to go upstairs. She'd brought a book called The Hidden Staircase by Carolyn Keene, and she liked reading in bed. "Not tonight," Grandma said. She sat at her ease in the platform rocker with her sewing basket at her feet. She didn't do much fancy needlework, but she mended everything. Mary Alice came over to lean against me while I worked on Colonel Linenberg. When it got so dark I couldn't see the puzzle, I reached to turn on the lamp, but Grandma said, "Not tonight." By then we had to know we were in for something. "Shut the front door," Grandma told Mary Alice, who was just a little gray shape, mouse-like, as she went over to close it. "And shoot the bolt across," said Grandma, who never locked her doors. Now we 3 were only outlines in the dark parlor. Some plot was afoot. Mary Alice edged back on the settee. We were all waiting for something. It was dark now. I could picture what the house looked like from outside.